Hello, I'm Tony Kay. Welcome to Property Point. Once again, I'm joined by Nerida Conisbee from REA Group.
Hi, Tony.
You've been on a roadshow recently going out to some of the regional areas in Australia, in Victoria particularly. What have you seen there?
Yeah, I was in Ballarat earlier this week, and it's interesting. I mean, Ballarat's such an interesting market. It's a fairly low growth market. I think prices have only increased around 3 to 4% over the past 12 months, and it's cheap as well. So, the median is half the price of Melbourne. But when we have a look at some of the most popular suburbs at the moment in Ballarat, they do tend to be in inner Ballarat and at fairly affordable price points. So, I think there's a bit of first home buyer activity in that area, particularly coming from Melbourne, to get sort of period type homes close to the CBD.
Actually, now you mention it, I know some people who've just recently moved out towards Ballarat, and purely from an affordability point of view.
Yeah, I mean, there's some good news in Ballarat, and there's some talk around a new train line, not a new train line, a faster train. At the moment, I think it's about an hour and 20 minutes to get in from Ballarat, but the new train would take it into under an hour to get into the city. So, if that happens, that will really change the Ballarat market.
So this is going on all over the place, really, up in New South Wales, in other states as well. And there's this, migration out of the really expensive cities into the regional areas?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of drivers. I mean, Geelong is another good example, that Geelong, you can get into the city in an hour. Central Coast in New South Wales is very popular at the moment. I think partly it's the fact that people want affordable homes, so they're looking in these areas to get affordability, but also the way people are working is changing, and then, for a lot of people, you don't necessarily need to be in the office 5 days a week. You can potentially work from home a couple of days a week. So that makes a difference. One of the interesting things that's happened in the Central Coast, though, is that we are seeing continued business growth there. And on Real Commercial, we track the areas most in demand for commercial buyers and people wanting to lease commercial space. And in New South Wales, the number one location at the moment is Central Coast. So it's coming above Sydney CBD. It's coming above the inner west of Sydney. And it's quite amazing to see that progression from an area that's very high in demand from buyers of residential to then proceeding on to commercial property as well.
We've talked in the past about how regional areas probably slower capital growth, but higher rental yields, as opposed to the big cities. Is that a factor coming into this as well?
Look, it depends where you go. I mean, if you go to somewhere like Gold Coast at the moment, Gold Coast is seeing stronger price growth than Brisbane, for example. So, I think those regional areas that are acting as commuter locations to major capital cities are probably outperforming capital cities in some cases. And when we move into more regional areas where you can't necessarily commute in, we typically see fairly flat price growth, but yields are generally pretty good. So, I think there's always that balance. Some people, when people are investing, most people when they're investing want capital growth, but there are some decent yields that can be found in regional Australia.
So, just working our way around the country a little bit, but up in New South Wales, what would be the stronger regional areas that are getting interest?
Yeah, I mean, Central Coast and Wollongong are the top ones, but even Orange, we're seeing a bit of demand there. I mean, part of it, there's been quite a few government departments moving out there, and that seems to be increasing demand. Newcastle is another one. So Newcastle sees pretty high demand. So not really a commuter location, but I think there's quite a bit of jobs growth occurring there at the moment.
And Brisbane, I presume, really the Gold Coast would be the major sort of satellite area?
Yeah, Gold Coast, lesser extent Sunshine Coast. We're starting to see a bit of growth in Townsville. So Townsville prices are still declining overall, but some of the premium suburbs are going up. So Castle Hill in Townsville starting to see some decent price growth, and that will continue now. I think Townsville's really hit the bottom of the market.
What about Adelaide and Perth?
Adelaide, we don't really see much activity in regional areas, and Perth is the same. I think both those markets are fairly affordable at the moment. I mean, Adelaide's certainly very affordable, so there's not that same pressure to move into regional areas in the same way that we see in Melbourne, Sydney and even Brisbane.
Yeah, so it's very much a Sydney, Melbourne type story, really.
Yeah, and Brisbane to a lesser extent. I mean, Darwin's another interesting market. We're starting to see quite a bit of movement in Darwin, particularly northern suburbs close to the university. But Alice Springs came up in our top list of most in-demand locations in Northern Territory recently. So, they're tiny markets. So, you do need to be very careful investing in them, but it's certainly worth having a look.
There was a bit of talk around, it was either early last year or late 2015, around dusting off the old high-speed train network from Melbourne to Sydney, sort of via Canberra, etc. So be interested to see what happens there in terms of demand.
Yeah, look, any infrastructure, particularly public transport infrastructure, makes a massive difference to demand on our site. And we saw it last year with the North West train line in Sydney. As soon as that was announced, we saw big jumps in prices in places like Kellyville. The airport announcement last year as well in Western Sydney led to a really big jump in prices for housing in that area. So, yeah, if that train line comes in and it makes it quick to come into Sydney, Canberra or Melbourne, it will make a big difference for those locations.
All right, Nerida, we'll leave it there again. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks for joining us on Property Point.